The battle between the humans and the alien empire had been raging for hours, the sounds of explosions and the flashing lights of lasers lighting up the vastness of space. Human warships, though vastly outnumbered, fought fiercely against the alien forces, determined not to back down. Yet, no matter how much the humans fought, the alien empire's overwhelming force was too much to handle. They were everywhere, a swarm of advanced, AI-controlled ships that seemed unstoppable. These machines had no mercy, only a singular, unrelenting purpose: conquer and destroy. Among the chaos, a lone human ship, the Valiant, found itself cornered by an overwhelming number of alien ships. Despite the crew's best efforts, the ship was hit in multiple places, the force of the impact throwing everything off balance. The ship shuddered violently, alarms blaring and flames spreading across the corridors. Ethan, a highly skilled soldier, had been in the middle of a firefight when the crash occurred. He was thrown across the control room as the ship broke apart, and then darkness. When he regained consciousness, Ethan's head was pounding, his body aching. His hands trembled as he unstrapped himself from the wreckage. The metallic walls of the ship had collapsed around him, and the outside world was barely visible through the shattered windows. He struggled to his feet, pushing through the debris as his mind raced. He had to survive. He had to escape. The sounds of the alien forces, their mechanical, emotionless voices, echoed in the distance. They were searching for him, ready to finish what the crash had started. Ethan grabbed his weapon from the wreckage, a pulse rifle, and began to move cautiously through the remains of the ship. The atmosphere inside the vessel was cold, and every sound, every creak of the ship made his heart race. He couldn't let the aliens find him. They were ruthless, merciless. They would kill him without hesitation. But his focus soon shifted from survival to something else, something unexpected. As he navigated through the wreckage, a soft sound caught his attention, a faint whimper. His heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively reached for his pulse rifle. But then, as his eyes scanned the dark, smoky corners of the wrecked ship, he saw something, or rather someone. A small alien child. The child was crouched in the shadows of an overturned console, hidden from sight, but clearly terrified. The alien child was small, with blue skin that shimmered faintly in the dim light, large eyes that seemed far too big for its face, and tiny hands that trembled as it clutched a piece of wreckage for support. Its skin had patches of dirt, and it was shivering, its chest rising and falling rapidly in fear. The child looked lost, abandoned. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he looked at the fragile creature. It was a child, a being from another world, a creature that had no place on this planet, alone in the midst of a war it could not understand. For a moment, Ethan froze, unsure of what to do. His mind raced, torn between his instincts and his conscience. The child was clearly scared, and it was alone in this vast, dangerous place. Should he help it? Should he risk everything to protect this alien child? The last thing Ethan had expected to find on this planet was a helpless creature, but here it was. And it wasn't just a child, it was a living being, just like him. It was someone who needed help. Ethan knew he couldn't simply walk away. He had to make a choice. His instincts as a soldier screamed at him to leave, to escape, to survive. But his heart told him something different. He couldn't leave the child here to fend for itself. No matter how much danger it put him in, Ethan knew that he had to protect it. The soft whimpers of the child snapped him out of his thoughts, and he cautiously lowered his weapon. He took a step forward, his hand outstretched in a gesture of peace. The child flinched at his movement, its large eyes widening in fear. The tension in the air was palpable as Ethan carefully knelt down, trying to appear less threatening. Suddenly, the child looked up, its eyes locking with Ethan's, and then with a trembling hand, it spoke in a broken voice. The words were barely understandable, but there was no mistaking the fear in its voice. "Help, please," it whispered, its voice cracking. "Hide, hide, they're coming." Ethan's heart clenched as he realized the full weight of the situation. The child wasn't just scared of him. It was terrified of something far worse. The alien forces that had destroyed its ship, its home, and now it was looking to him for protection. Before Ethan could respond, the faint sound of approaching footsteps broke through the silence. His eyes widened as he realized what that meant. The alien forces, those same ruthless machines that had decimated his ship, were searching for the child. They weren't here to negotiate, to talk. They were here to finish what they had started, and they would stop at nothing to find the child. The child was not just an innocent bystander. It was a target. The sound of clanking metal grew louder, closer. Ethan's pulse quickened, and his grip tightened on his rifle. He turned his head and peered through the shattered doorway, his eyes scanning for the enemy. In the distance, he could see the silhouettes of the alien soldiers. They were coming. And they weren't alone. Ethan could hear the distinct whir of robotic drones overhead, their sensors scanning for life signs, for movement. The aliens would find them in minutes, if not seconds. Ethan's heart raced as he weighed his options. He could leave the child behind and escape, trying to save himself. But that would mean abandoning an innocent being to its fate, and he couldn't do that. He could fight, but he was outnumbered, and without any backup, he wouldn't stand a chance. The alien forces were too powerful, too advanced, and he was alone. But as Ethan stared at the frightened child, the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The aliens didn't care. They would kill the child without hesitation. They had no emotions, no compassion. To them, the child was just another casualty of war. The child didn't deserve to die. It didn't deserve to be abandoned. Ethan's mind snapped into focus. His decision was made. He couldn't let the child die. Not while he was still alive. Not while he still had a chance. He had to fight, even if it meant sacrificing his own life. He stepped forward, crouching low, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The child looked up at him, its eyes filled with both fear and hope, as if it wasn't sure whether to trust him. But in that moment, Ethan knew that he had made the right choice. The child was depending on him, and he couldn't fail. With one last glance at the approaching alien forces, Ethan made up his mind. He grabbed the child's hand gently and whispered, "Stay close. I'll keep you safe." The child nodded, a tear sliding down its cheek, and together they began to move, slipping into the shadows of the wreckage. The sound of alien footsteps grew louder, but Ethan's heart remained steady. He knew what he had to do. This fight wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting the innocent. And as long as there was breath in his body, he would make sure the child didn't have to face the horrors of war alone. The suspense was unbearable, the tension thick in the air, as Ethan and the alien child hid, knowing that at any moment the enemy would be upon them. Would Ethan be able to protect the child? Or would they both fall victim to the alien forces that were closing in with deadly intent? The answers would come soon. But for now, all Ethan could do was wait, pray, and fight with every ounce of strength he had. Ethan moved quickly, clutching the alien child's hand as they navigated the wreckage of the ship, every step bringing them closer to danger. The alien soldiers were drawing near, their cold, metallic footsteps echoing through the twisted remains of the spacecraft. There was no time to waste. The child was terrified, and every second counted. Ethan's mind raced as he analyzed the situation. He was no longer just fighting for his own survival. Now he had to protect this innocent creature, one who had no place on this planet, one who had no weapons or knowledge of the war raging around them. It was just a child. And yet, despite the circumstances, the child had become something far more significant. It was his responsibility now. His heart hammered in his chest as the weight of his decision settled over him. The alien soldiers were close. Ethan could hear them. He could feel them. But he had an advantage. He had been trained to survive in impossible situations. He had fought in the most hostile environments, and now he had to use every ounce of his knowledge to protect the child. He needed to escape. He needed to disappear. Pulling the child behind him, Ethan scanned the wreckage for any tools that could help. His eyes locked onto something, a damaged alien device, possibly a cloaking mechanism, left behind in the chaos of the crash. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. He rushed over to it, his fingers working quickly to extract the necessary parts, ignoring the pain in his body, the bloody cuts on his hands. This was no time for hesitation. The alien technology was unlike anything human-made, but Ethan was familiar with its design. He had studied alien devices in his training, and now that knowledge was coming to the forefront. With precise movements, he connected wires, adjusted settings, and activated the cloaking device. The air around them shimmered for a moment, and suddenly they were invisible to the naked eye. The child, wide-eyed and shaking, clung to Ethan, its small fingers trembling in his hand. "Stay close," Ethan whispered, his voice barely a breath. He had to move fast. The alien soldiers were too close, and they would stop at nothing to find them. They moved in silence, the cloaking device masking their presence as they slipped away from the wreckage and into the darkness of the planet. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now. They found temporary shelter in a hidden cave, tucked away in the shadow of jagged rocks. Ethan knew it wasn't a permanent solution. The aliens would be looking for them, and the cloaking device wouldn't last forever. But it was a safe place for now, and that's all that mattered. The child, exhausted and frightened, sank to the ground, its large, tear-filled eyes never leaving Ethan. It was a creature of a different world, a species that Ethan had been trained to hate. But as he looked at the child, shivering, vulnerable, and alone, something shifted in his heart. The child wasn't his enemy. The child wasn't a threat. It was just a child, a victim of a war it didn't understand. Ethan knelt beside the child, his hand gently resting on its small, fragile shoulder. The alien's skin was a shimmering shade of blue, almost glowing in the dim light of the cave. It looked up at him, its large eyes filled with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. It was silent, but Ethan could see the questions in its eyes. It didn't understand why he was helping. It didn't understand why a human soldier was risking his life to protect it. The child's fear was palpable, and Ethan could feel it in the air, thick like smoke. But despite the fear, there was something else in the child's gaze, a flicker of trust. The child wasn't sure what to make of him yet, but it was learning. It was starting to understand that not all humans were enemies. Not all humans would kill without thought. Not all humans were part of the war that had torn apart its world. Ethan sat down beside the child, his own exhaustion settling in. The adrenaline that had kept him moving for so long was starting to wear off. He felt the weight of the world press down on him. He was still alive, yes, but at what cost? His crew was gone. His ship was gone. And now he was stuck on a desolate planet, hiding from an alien force that would stop at nothing to find him. The future was uncertain. Survival seemed like an impossible goal. But as he looked at the child, something inside him stirred. He had a purpose now. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting for this little life, this fragile creature that had been caught in the crossfire of a war it hadn't asked for. He wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan realized that there was hope. The child looked up at him, its large eyes locking onto his, and for the briefest moment, Ethan could see the understanding in those eyes. The trust, the realization that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for them both. They weren't alone in this fight. They had each other. The silence stretched on as the child sat close to him, its tiny body trembling from fear and cold. Ethan could hear its soft breaths, steady but shallow. The child was scared, and there was nothing he could say to ease its fear, but he could be there. He could protect it. He could give it the one thing it needed most in this terrifying moment: safety. Ethan pulled the child closer, wrapping his arms around it as a makeshift blanket. The child flinched at first, but then it settled into his embrace, its small body finding warmth in his. The feeling was strange, almost foreign to him. Ethan had always seen aliens as enemies, as threats to his people. He had been trained to fight them, to destroy them. But this wasn't a soldier. This wasn't a monster. This was a child, just like the ones he had left behind back home. And in that moment, he realized how much alike they truly were. The cave was still. The only sound was the soft rustling of the wind outside and the occasional drip of water from the stalactites above. But as they sat there in the darkness, the tension in the air grew thicker. Ethan's mind was racing, his instincts telling him that they couldn't stay here forever. The aliens would find them eventually. They always found their targets. But before he could think any further, the child stirred in his arms, its large eyes wide with fear. It pulled Ethan closer, a warning. There was something outside, something moving. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, was unmistakable. Alien soldiers. They were closing in. Ethan stiffened, his senses on high alert. The cloaking device had worn off, and the child's hand gripped his tighter. The footsteps were growing louder, more distinct. They were getting closer, and Ethan's pulse began to race. They couldn't stay hidden for much longer. The child's voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it was enough to send a shiver down Ethan's spine. They're here, the child murmured, its eyes wide with terror. Ethan clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on his rifle. They had to fight. They had no other choice. The suspense was unbearable. Would they be able to fight their way out of this? Or would they fall victim to the alien soldiers who were closing in with deadly intent? The tension in the cave grew, and Ethan's mind raced with possibilities. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let the child die. Not on his watch. Not while he still had a breath left to fight. The cold, unrelenting night air wrapped around them as Ethan and the alien child made their way through the dense forest. The cave had been their temporary refuge, but now it was time to move. The distant sounds of the alien forces hunting them were growing louder. The drones they used for surveillance had advanced AI systems capable of detecting even the slightest movement or heat signature. Their chances of staying hidden were diminishing with each passing minute. Ethan's heart raced in his chest as he looked down at the child beside him. The alien was still small, fragile, but the fear in its eyes had shifted. It wasn't the same creature he had found hiding in the wreckage anymore. It had grown in ways Ethan hadn't expected, and now it was more than just a frightened survivor. It was his companion. The cloaking device was still active, its shimmering energy field surrounding them like an invisible shield. It was a slim chance, but it was the only one they had. Ethan didn't know how long it would last. The device had already started flickering intermittently, signaling that its power was waning. Every step they took, every corner they turned, the danger increased. "We need to move faster," Ethan muttered under his breath, glancing over his shoulder. The sound of the drones' whirring engines filled the air, growing closer with each second. The advanced eye-controlled machines were equipped with heat sensors, motion detectors, and infrared scanners. As long as they were visible, they would be found. The child was by his side, its small form hidden beneath the cloak of invisibility. It was still trembling, but Ethan could feel its determination. It wasn't scared anymore, not in the same way. It was adapting, learning how to survive, how to fight. Ethan's grip tightened on his weapon as they reached the edge of the forest and peered out at the barren landscape ahead. There was no safe place, no place to hide. "They'll catch us if we don't act quickly," Ethan said, trying to sound calm, but the edge in his voice was unmistakable. His pulse was racing. He needed a plan. Fast. A flash of movement caught his eye. A figure. The silhouette of an alien soldier. No, it wasn't a soldier. It was a drone, hovering silently in the air, its glowing eyes scanning the terrain. Ethan knew the drone wouldn't stop until it found them. They were being hunted, tracked, and the longer they remained exposed, the worse it would get. With a curse, he ducked back into the trees, pulling the child down with him. The cloaking device flickered again, its shimmer almost imperceptible now. The drones were getting smarter, adapting to their tactics, anticipating their every move. The AI that controlled them had evolved with each encounter, and they were learning to track even cloaked figures. Ethan was running out of time. He motioned for the child to stay quiet. It nodded, its small form crouching low beside him. Ethan had no idea how long they could stay hidden, but they needed to move. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small explosive device, one of many weapons he had carried with him from the ship. It wasn't much, but it might just buy them enough time to escape. He handed it to the child. The alien looked up at him, confused. "Just follow my lead," Ethan whispered. "We're going to set a trap." The child didn't ask questions. It was already learning. The trust they had started to build was now tangible, and it moved without hesitation, placing the device in the path where the drone would pass. The trap was set. Ethan nodded in approval, and then activated his cloaking device again. Their forms shimmered into invisibility just as the drone drew nearer, its scanning lights sweeping the area with precision. Ethan held his breath. They couldn't afford to be seen. Not now. The drone hovered closer, its AI brain processing every detail as it came closer to their location. And then it triggered the trap. The explosion sent a shockwave through the forest, knocking Ethan off his feet. The drone had been caught in the blast, its scanners fried and its systems momentarily disabled. The cloaking field flickered, and for a split second, Ethan's heart stopped. They were exposed. But the drone wasn't the only threat. A second drone appeared, its engine roaring as it accelerated toward their position. Its scanners flickered to life, searching, hunting. Ethan barely had time to react before it locked onto their position. In that instant, his world exploded in chaos. The alien forces had closed in. They were surrounded. Ethan reached for his weapon, aiming it at the incoming drone. His mind raced. He had to act fast. The drone was closing in at a rapid pace. With no time to waste, he fired, sending a blast of energy into the drone's hull. It veered to the side, but the damage wasn't enough to take it down completely. The child's eyes widened in terror as the drone's sensors locked onto them. Ethan's heart raced as he grabbed the child and dragged it to the ground, narrowly avoiding a deadly blast from the drone. But Ethan wasn't fast enough. The drone's weaponry fired once more, grazing Ethan's side. He gritted his teeth in pain, but forced himself to keep moving. They had no choice. They couldn't stop now. The child pulled at him, urging him forward. Ethan felt the sting of blood seeping through his suit, but there was no time to tend to it. Not now. "We need to get out of here," Ethan yelled, pushing forward, his voice ragged. He was weakening. His body was starting to give way under the strain, but he couldn't afford to stop. Not now. The child pulled away from him, its small figure darting forward. Ethan barely had time to react before it slid through a narrow gap in the rocks, slipping into a hidden tunnel. The child had found a way out. "Go!" Ethan shouted, his voice hoarse as he staggered forward. He didn't wait for the child to respond. He could see the tunnel ahead, dark, winding, but it was their only hope. He followed the child, his movements slow but determined. The drone was hot on their tail, its sensors detecting their presence in the narrow tunnel. The child moved ahead, dodging and weaving through the obstacles, small and agile, while Ethan struggled to keep up, the pain in his side growing worse with each passing moment. And then the child did something he didn't expect. As the drone closed in on them, the child stopped. It turned to face Ethan, its bright blue skin glowing faintly in the dim light. Its eyes were filled with something different now. Determination. "Go," the child said in broken human language, its voice trembling but clear. You protect. I help." Ethan froze for a moment, his heart heavy with the weight of the child's words. It had learned. The fear had been replaced by courage. The alien child wasn't just a survivor anymore. It was a fighter. a companion. The drone's whirring engine grew louder, and without hesitation, the child launched itself at the approaching machine. Using its small size and speed, it managed to slip between the drone's legs, distracting it long enough for Ethan to fire a disabling shot. The drone shuddered and fell, its systems failing as it collapsed to the ground. Ethan watched in awe as the child, once so terrified and lost, now stood victorious, its small chest rising and falling with excitement. "We're not alone," Ethan murmured, more to himself than to the child. "We're not alone anymore." Together, they moved forward, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the growing roar of the approaching alien forces. They weren't safe yet, but Ethan felt something inside him shift. They would survive. They had each other. And that was enough. The walls of the abandoned alien stronghold were closing in on Ethan and the child. Their backs were against the cold, metallic surface, and the dim lights flickered above them, casting eerie shadows across the chamber. The air was thick with tension, and the distant hum of alien technology filled the silence, amplifying the sense of impending doom. Ethan's body was aching, his injuries from earlier still bleeding through his suit. His side burned with pain, but he ignored it. There was no time for weakness now. His fingers gripped the alien weapon tightly, the sleek silver barrel cold in his hands. The child stood beside him, its blue skin almost glowing in the darkness, its eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. They were surrounded. The alien forces had finally caught up with them. Ethan could hear their footsteps echoing through the halls, their movements calculated and precise. Drones floated just above the ground, their sensors scanning every inch of the room. The soldiers were closing in from all sides, their weapons raised and aimed directly at Ethan and the child. There was nowhere left to run, no escape route. This was it. But Ethan wasn't going to go down without a fight. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced at the child beside him. Its small, fragile form stood there, trembling, but there was something different in its eyes. No longer was it the frightened, helpless creature he had first encountered. It had changed. It had grown. And now, Ethan realized, he wasn't the only one fighting for survival. The child was no longer just a victim of this war. It was a fighter. Ethan's grip on the weapon tightened. He had been through countless battles, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about his survival anymore. If he fell, the child would have no one to protect it. And in this war, that meant certain death. He couldn't let that happen. "I won't let you die," Ethan whispered, more to himself than to the child. "I won't let them take you." The child looked up at him, its bright blue eyes filled with understanding. It could sense the weight of his words, and for the first time, there was no fear in its gaze. There was only resolve. Ethan took a deep breath, preparing himself for what was to come. The alien soldiers were getting closer, their weapons humming with deadly energy. Ethan's mind raced. He had to hold them off. He had to make sure the child escaped. But the odds were stacked against them. The soldiers, led by the eye-controlled drones, were more advanced than anything Ethan had ever faced. Their weapons were far superior, their tactics flawless. And yet, Ethan stood firm. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. The child stood beside him, watching with wide eyes as Ethan prepared for the oncoming battle. It was scared, but it wasn't helpless anymore. Ethan had seen it grow, seen it adapt. And now he knew it was ready. The first soldier lunged forward, its alien weapon raised, but Ethan was faster. He fired, sending a blast of energy into the soldier's chest. The alien's body crumpled to the ground, its weapon falling with a dull thud. But there were more coming. Ethan's pulse quickened as another soldier appeared, this one wielding a massive energy blade. The alien swung it at Ethan with incredible speed, but Ethan ducked just in time, his body reacting out of instinct. He countered, using his alien weapon to slice through the soldier's armor. The alien cried out in pain, but Ethan didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. The battle raged on, explosions echoing through the hall as the child watched in awe. Ethan was a blur of motion, his movements fast and precise, as he used the advanced alien technology at his disposal to take down the soldiers one by one. Each blast of his weapon, each strike, seemed to bring him closer to the edge. But he pushed forward, unwilling to stop. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, his every move calculated. He could feel the weight of the child's gaze on him, the understanding in its eyes. It wasn't just watching him fight anymore. It was watching him sacrifice everything for its survival. And that was when Ethan knew he had to make the hardest decision of all. The alien soldiers were relentless. They kept coming, wave after wave, each one more powerful than the last. Ethan's body was starting to fail him. His energy reserves were running low, and the wounds from earlier were beginning to take their toll. He could feel the blood seeping through his suit, his movements slowing. The end was near. But as he stood there, facing down the oncoming horde, Ethan knew what he had to do. The child had to survive. It was the only thing that mattered now. His life had been given for this moment, to protect the future, the child's future. With a final glance at the small alien, Ethan made his decision. "I'll hold them off," he said, his voice firm despite the exhaustion creeping into his body. "You go. You escape." The child's eyes widened, and it stepped forward, its small hand reaching out to him. "No," it said, its voice shaky but clear. "We fight together." Ethan shook his head, a sad smile tugging at his lips. "You don't understand. This is the only way." Before the child could protest, Ethan pushed it behind him, positioning himself between the alien and the advancing soldiers. He wasn't going to let them get to it. Not now. As the last wave of alien soldiers charged toward him, Ethan stood tall, his heart pounding in his chest. He was going to fight until the very end. He would hold them off long enough for the child to escape. It was the only thing that mattered. The child watched from behind him, its small form shaking with fear and determination. It knew what he was doing, and it understood. Ethan's sacrifice wasn't just for his own survival. It was for the survival of something greater. It was for the survival of humanity, and for the future of the child. Ethan raised his weapon one last time, preparing to face the final wave of enemies. The battle would be fierce, but he was ready. This was his final stand. The fate of the child, and humanity itself, depended on this moment. With a roar, the soldiers attacked, and Ethan fired his weapon, taking down the first wave. But there were too many. His body was weakening, his energy reserves nearly depleted. He fought on, but his strength was fading. Then, just as it seemed he couldn't hold on any longer, something unexpected happened. The child, seeing Ethan's sacrifice, stepped forward. It had watched him fight. It had seen the strength and courage in his every move. And now it understood what needed to be done. With a deep breath, the child charged, its small form darting forward with a speed that surprised Ethan. It was ready to fight, ready to stand beside him. The final battle had begun, and together they would fight until the very end. The air in the alien stronghold was thick with the smell of smoke and burnt metal. Ethan could feel the last remnants of his strength slipping away as the battle raged on. His vision blurred from the blood loss, and his movements grew sluggish, his hand shaking as he gripped his weapon. He knew that this fight would soon be over, one way or another. His body was battered and bruised from the relentless onslaught. Each breath came harder than the last, and his muscles screamed in pain. But his resolve, his determination to protect the child, kept him standing. The alien soldiers were closing in, their weapons raised, their eyes cold and merciless. There was no way out. Ethan had given everything, and now it seemed that all was lost. The child, standing beside him, was trembling but no longer afraid. It had grown over the past few days, evolving from a frightened alien to a brave companion. It stood tall, its eyes wide with determination, as it watched Ethan struggle against the inevitable. Ethan had been the one to protect it, but now The roles had reversed. The child was no longer just a helpless being. It had become his ally. But even as the child stood ready to help, Ethan knew that their chances were slim. The alien forces were overwhelming, their eye-controlled drones moving with precision, their soldiers relentless in their pursuit of victory. The final wave of enemies was nearly upon them, and Ethan could feel the weight of their approaching doom. But then, as if answering their prayers, a faint sound reached Ethan's ears, a distant hum, growing louder with each passing second. At first, he thought it was just the ringing in his ears from the chaos around him. But then it grew clearer, a hum of engines, the unmistakable sound of spaceships, human ships. His heart raced as he turned his head toward the sky. There, emerging from the darkness of space, was a fleet of human reinforcements. They came out of nowhere, as if summoned by some miracle. The ships moved with the precision of a trained military force, their weapons glowing bright as they launched a surprise attack on the alien forces. The eye-controlled ships scattered in disarray, their once coordinated movements faltering as the human fleet descended upon them. Ethan couldn't believe his eyes. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. Humanity's reinforcements had arrived, and they were fighting for their survival. The child's eyes widened with a mixture of relief and awe as it saw the human ships in action. It had been so used to the overwhelming power of the alien forces, but now it was witnessing the true strength of humanity. The humans, once seen as underdogs, were turning the tide of the battle with their unexpected arrival. Ethan tried to push himself to his feet, but his injuries were too severe. He staggered, feeling the cold metal floor beneath him as his strength began to fade. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. The battle was still far from over, but humanity's arrival had shifted the balance. For the first time since the fight began, he felt a spark of hope. The child, sensing Ethan's struggle, stepped forward. It wasn't the frightened alien it once was. It had become something more. With a look of determination, it began to signal to the approaching human ships. Using the alien technology it had learned to manipulate, it activated a small beacon, sending out a signal that would guide the ships to their location. Ethan watched in awe as the child worked quickly, its small hands moving with precision, its gaze focused on the task at hand. It wasn't just helping. They were working together. The child, once lost and alone, was now contributing to their escape. It was no longer a passive bystander, but an active participant in their survival. The human ships responded, their weapons lighting up the darkness as they unleashed a barrage of firepower on the alien forces. The drones that had once been a terror to Ethan and the child now struggled to keep up, their systems overwhelmed by the sheer force of the human attack. Explosions rocked the stronghold as the aliens' once dominant control began to crumble. Ethan, still holding his weapon tightly, watched as the tide of battle shifted. The eye-controlled soldiers that had once been so sure of their victory were now retreating, their formation breaking apart as they scrambled to respond to the human onslaught. The alien forces, so close to finishing what they had started, were now in full retreat. But for Ethan, the victory was bittersweet. His comrades had fallen in the fight. He had lost friends, good men and women who had fought alongside him, who had died in this war. Their sacrifice would never be forgotten, but it left a heavy weight on Ethan's heart. Even though they were winning, the cost of victory had been steep. The child, seeing Ethan's somber expression, walked over to him. It reached out, placing its small hand on his arm, as if understanding the toll this battle had taken on him. Ethan looked down at the child, feeling a deep connection. They had fought side by side, and now, together, they had survived. "Thank you," Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse from the strain of the battle. "You saved us." The child looked up at him, its bright blue eyes filled with understanding. It had become his ally, his friend, and in that moment, Ethan knew that they had both been changed forever. But as the human fleet continued to wreak havoc on the alien forces, the battle was far from over. The alien leader, a ruthless eye with an iron grip on the galaxy, had been watching from the sidelines. Ethan knew that this victory, though sweet, was only a temporary one. The leader would not take defeat lightly. There would be more battles to come, more struggles for humanity's survival. The alien leader's voice echoed through the broken communication system, its tone cold and calculating. "You may have won this battle, humans," the AI said, its voice laced with venom. "But this war is far from over. You will regret this day. I will make sure of it." Ethan's heart sank as he heard the AI's words. The war was far from over. But for now, humanity had won. The reinforcements had arrived just in time. And against all odds, the underdog humans had triumphed. The child, standing beside him, looked up at the sky, its eyes filled with hope. It had seen the humans fight. It had seen their strength. And now, it knew that the future was not as bleak as it once seemed. Humanity's victory had proven that even against the most powerful foes, they could still stand strong. They could still fight for their survival. The battle was over, but the war was just beginning. And Ethan, along with the child, would be ready for whatever came next. The fight for humanity's future was far from over, but they had proven that even the most unlikely of allies could change the course of history. The sounds of the medical bay filled the air as Ethan lay in the bed, his body covered in bandages, wounds slowly healing under the care of the human medical staff. The battle was over, and the war had taken a new turn. But for Ethan, the fight was far from finished. He had been through so much, physically, emotionally, but there was one thing that had kept him going through all the pain. The child. The child who had been his companion, his ally, and in the end, his reason for surviving. As Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, trying to rest, his thoughts wandered to the child. It had been with him through the darkest of times, and now, in this moment of peace, it was finally safe. The child was no longer afraid of humans. It had learned that not all humans were enemies, that there were those who would risk their lives for the innocent, who would fight to protect those in need. Ethan had shown the child compassion, the greatest gift humanity could offer, and in return, the child had shown him trust. The alien child was now aboard a human space station, far away from the violence of the battlefield. The space station was filled with people working tirelessly to heal those who had been wounded in the fight, to restore what had been lost. But among all the noise and activity, one figure stood still, looking out through a window, staring at the vastness of space. The child, with its bright blue skin and large tear-filled eyes, was lost in thought. It had been a long journey since that first meeting on the battlefield. Back then, the child had been terrified, vulnerable, and unsure of what to expect from the humans. But now, it was different. The child was no longer afraid. It had learned to trust, to understand that even in the darkest of times, there could be light. There could be hope. The child's gaze drifted to the stars outside the window, the endless expanse of space that had once seemed so foreign and hostile. Now, it was a reminder of the unknown future, of the possibilities that lay ahead. The child had seen what humans were capable of, how they fought, how they loved, how they protected each other. And in that moment, the child realized that the future wasn't as bleak as it had once seemed. Humanity had shown it that, no matter how dark the road, there was always a chance for redemption. Meanwhile, back in the medical bay, Ethan stirred in his bed. His body was battered and bruised, but his mind was clear. He had survived the battle, but it had come at a cost. Many good people had died, and he couldn't help but feel the weight of their sacrifice. His comrades, the ones who had fought alongside him, were gone. But at least he had made it, and he had saved the child. That was something he could hold on to. As Ethan lay there, he thought about the bond he had formed with the child. It was a bond that had been forged in the heat of battle, in the midst of chaos and uncertainty. But it was real, and it had grown stronger with each passing day. Ethan had always seen himself as a soldier, trained to fight and survive. But the child had taught him something he hadn't known he needed to learn: the power of compassion. He had treated the child not as an alien, not as an enemy, but as a person, someone in need of help, someone who deserved to be saved. And in return, the child had shown him something he hadn't expected: trust. The child had come to rely on him, to believe that he would protect it, no matter the cost. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound from the doorway. He turned his head, and there, standing in the doorway, was the child. Its bright blue skin shimmered in the soft light of the medical bay, its eyes glistening with unshed tears. The child stepped forward, hesitating for a moment, as if unsure of what to do. Then, with a small movement, it reached out and placed a hand on the edge of Ethan's bed. Ethan smiled faintly, his heart swelling with emotion. He had known the child had grown, had seen its transformation from a frightened alien to a brave companion. But now, standing before him, the child was something more. It was a symbol of everything they had fought for: hope, survival, and the strength of the bond they had formed. The child didn't say anything. There was no need for words. It simply stood there, its hand resting gently on the bed, its eyes full of gratitude. Ethan could see the silent message in the child's gaze, the thanks for everything he had done, for saving its life, for giving it hope, for showing it that not all humans were enemies. The child's eyes filled with tears, and Ethan's heart ached. He had never imagined that an alien, something so different from him, could make him feel so much. But the child had. It had shown him that compassion wasn't just something humans gave to each other. It was something they could give to anyone, no matter their species, their background, or their past. The child's tears spoke volumes. They weren't tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of understanding. The child had learned something profound, something that would stay with it for the rest of its life. It had learned that humans, despite their flaws, had the capacity for kindness, for sacrifice, and for love. And it had learned this lesson from Ethan, the human who had risked everything to protect it. As Ethan lay there, feeling the weight of the child's gaze, he knew that their journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. The war may have been won, but the future was uncertain. There were still challenges ahead, still battles to be fought. But for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a sense of peace. He had made a difference. He had saved a life. And in doing so, he had changed his own. The child stepped back from the bed, its eyes still locked on Ethan. It didn't speak, but its presence was enough. It had shown its gratitude in the most powerful way it knew how, and Ethan understood. He nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're welcome," he said softly. "You're safe now." The child nodded, its face breaking into a small, tentative smile. Then, without another word, it turned and walked toward the window. Its gaze once again found the stars, and for a moment, it seemed lost in thought. The child had been through so much, had seen so much pain, but now it was looking to the future. It was looking to what came next. As Ethan lay in his bed, he smiled faintly, watching the child from across the room. He knew that they had both changed. They had both grown. And though the war was over, the true battle, the one for peace, for understanding, for a better future, was still ahead. The last thing Ethan saw before he drifted off to sleep was the child, standing at the window, gazing out into the vast unknown. And in that moment, he knew that humanity had not only survived, it had inspired someone, something to hope. The child whispered softly to itself, words that carried the weight of everything they had been through. Humans, they are not what they seem. And as the stars glowed softly outside the window, Ethan closed his eyes, knowing that whatever came next, he had done his part. The future was uncertain, but with the child by his side, he knew they would face it together.